She cleaned other people's houses for 19 years, never missed a Tuesday, never called in sick, never asked for anything she had not already earned twice over. Her daughter wore a white dress on a Saturday in June, stood at the altar of a church that held 300 people, and when the pastor asked who had shaped her into the woman she had become, she turned toward the front row and said a name. It was not her mother's name. Della Reyes was still holding her program. She was still smiling. She had not understood yet what she had just heard. The alarm went off at 5:10 a.m. Della Reyes had stopped registering it as sound a long time ago. It was simply the border between one kind of dark and another, the signal that the body needed to leave the bed regardless of what the bed wanted to offer. She dressed without turning on the light. The bedroom of the apartment on Clover Street was small enough that her hands knew where everything was without looking. Uniform shirt on the hook behind the door, black pants folded on the chair, the shoes with the extra insole she had bought at the drugstore because her left heel had developed a bruise that never fully healed, but that she could not afford to stop walking on. She made coffee. She drank it standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down in the morning created the illusion that the day had not started yet, and the day had started and there were 4 houses to get through before 3 o'clock. The first house was on Birchwood. The second was on Halcyon Drive. The third and fourth were in the same subdivision off Route 9 side by side, owned by people who could afford a housekeeper and a pool and a weekly grocery delivery, but who could not be bothered to rinse a dish before leaving it in the sink. Della rinsed the dishes. She mopped the floors. She changed the sheets and folded the towels and wiped down the baseboards with the kind of attention you bring to a task when the task is all you have, and doing it well is the only version of pride still available to you. She had started cleaning houses when Noelle was 4. Before that, she had worked the overnight shift at a distribution warehouse 40 minutes from where they lived, packing boxes on a conveyor line while her mother watched Noelle in the apartment upstairs. Her mother had died in the spring of the year. Noelle turned 3. A stroke. Quick. No warning. The kind of death that arrives without the courtesy of preparation. After that, there was no one to watch Noelle at night, so Della found the cleaning work, which she could do during school hours, and she built the schedule around her daughter the way you build everything, when there is only one of you and one of them, and the distance between those two numbers is the whole world. Noelle Reyes at 7 years old sat on the floor of whichever house her mother was cleaning and did her homework in the margins of the time that was available. Della kept a bag in the back seat of the car with coloring books and worksheets and a small bottle of apple juice, and Noelle understood without being told that the houses were not theirs, that the things inside them were not to be touched, that her job was to be quiet and good and not make any part of her mother's day harder than it already was. She was good at it. She was good at most things. She had her mother's hands, the long fingers, the tendency to grip a pencil too hard, and she had her mother's stubbornness, which in a 7-year-old presented as focus, and in a 17-year-old would present as something the school counselor called drive, and in a 25-year-old would present as the quality that got her into the MBA program at Georgia State on a partial scholarship while working 30 hours a week. Della read the acceptance letter standing at the kitchen counter, the same counter where she drank her coffee every morning. She read it twice. She pressed it flat with both hands the way you press something when you are afraid the words will rearrange themselves if you look away. She called Noelle. Noelle picked up on the second ring and said, before Della could speak, "Did it come?" Della said, "It came." There was a sound on the other end that Della had not heard in a long time. She cataloged it automatically, the way nurses catalog breathing and the way Della had learned to catalog her daughter, the particular frequency of a happiness that had not yet learned to protect itself. The family that changed things was named Whitmore. Frank and Joanna Whitmore, Halcyon Drive, the house Della had been cleaning every Thursday for 6 years. Frank was a partner at a law firm downtown. Joanna ran a nonprofit that provided college prep resources to first-generation students. They had one daughter, Brianna, who was 3 years younger than Noelle and who attended the same university for her undergraduate degree 2 years after Noelle started there. Noelle met Brianna through a student mentorship program. Brianna mentioned her family's housekeeper casually in a way that people mention things they have never had to think about. She said, "Our housekeeper has been with us forever. My mom loves her." She did not say the housekeeper's name. She did not know that the housekeeper's daughter was sitting across the table from her in the university cafeteria. Noelle did not say anything. She had been not saying things like this her entire life. The habit had started in those early years on the floor of other people's houses, with her coloring book and her apple juice, and it had calcified into something useful. A composure that read as maturity and that people in professional settings rewarded without understanding where it had come from. She went home that weekend. She told Della about Brianna. She did not tell her about the housekeeper comment. She said, "She seems nice. Her parents are involved in college access work." Della said, "That's good work." She was making rice on the stove. She stirred it with her right hand and pressed her left hand into the base of her spine, the place where the pain from standing lived. The L3 region. She knew this because she had looked it up once and then stopped looking, because knowing the name of the thing did not change the thing. The Whitmore family began including Noelle in things. Dinners, first, when Brianna brought her home on a Friday, and Joanna set an extra place at the table without hesitation. Then a spring break trip to visit colleges in the Northeast. Just the three of them, Joanna and Brianna and Noelle. Because Joanna said she had room in the car, and Noelle had not been to see any of those schools, and it was not a big deal. It was a big deal. Noelle knew it was a big deal, and she accepted it the way you accept something when refusing would cost more than receiving. Joanna Whitmore paid for Noelle's GMAT preparation course. She did it through the nonprofit, so it was technically a scholarship, technically not personal. She told Noelle it was an investment. The word investment landed in a specific way. Della had never used that word. Della used words like manage and stretch, and we'll figure it out. The vocabulary of two different worlds, both of them love, but only one of them legible to the world. Noelle was trying to enter. Noelle was 22. She did not yet understand that both languages were love. She only understood that one of them felt lighter to carry. Della cleaned the Whitmore house every Thursday for 6 years without Joanna knowing whose mother she was. This is the part of the story that requires understanding rather than judgment, because the not knowing was not a secret Della kept on purpose. It had simply never come up. Noelle had never mentioned her mother's name in the Whitmore house, and Della's last name was Reyes. And Noelle went by Reyes Carter at school, hyphenated with her father's name, a man who had been gone since Noelle was 18 months old, and whose contribution to her life was exactly half a surname. Della knew about the Whitmores. She cleaned their house. She knew the way Joanna organized her spice rack by cuisine, and the way Frank left his reading glasses on the kitchen counter even though there was a holder for them on the desk. She knew that Brianna had a birthmark on her left shoulder because she had washed that girl's sheets and seen the mark on the pillowcase cream, and made the connection without meaning to. She knew the Whitmore house the way she knew all the houses, intimately and invisibly, the way people know the insides of things they are never asked to inhabit. She did not know that Joanna had taken her daughter on a college tour. Noelle had told her she was going with a friend from school. Della had said, "Take a jacket. The Northeast is cold." That was the whole conversation. When Noelle got into the MBA program, Joanna Whitmore texted her that same evening. "Brianna told me, I am so proud of you. You worked for every inch of this." Noelle read the text standing in her apartment, and she felt something she did not have a clean word for, the warmth of being seen by someone in a room with good lighting, and the faint guilt of a person who understands that the room was built by someone else's hands. The year Noelle started the MBA program was the year Della's body began sending the kind of notices that bodies send when they have been overdrawn for too long. The bruise on her left heel became a wound that did not close properly. The pain at L3 spread to L4 and then down the left leg, a numbness that came and went like a tide. Her right hand developed a tremor when she was tired, which was almost always a fine shake that she could feel. But that was not yet visible to the clients whose countertops she wiped, and whose windows she cleaned, and whose children's rooms she straightened with the same care she brought to everything. She did not tell Noella. Noelle had tuition. Noelle had rent. Noelle had the specific financial terror of a first-generation graduate student who understands that the margin for error is exactly 0. Della was not going to hand her daughter something else to carry. She had spent 19 years making sure the weight was distributed correctly. with as much as possible on her own back and as little as possible on her daughter's, and she was not going to change the distribution now when Noelle was this close to the thing they had both been building toward. She bought compression wraps for her heel at the pharmacy. She took ibuprofen in the morning, and at noon, and sometimes again in the evening, and stopped counting how many. Because counting meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant stopping, and stopping was not a verb she had ever learned to conjugate. The wedding was Noelle's idea in the way that ideas belong to the person who has them. But it was also the product of 3 years in the Whitmore orbit. The man Noelle was marrying was named Curtis Bell, 31. An engineer, steady and good-humored, and the kind of quiet that is not emptiness but is actually a room with good acoustics. He had met Noelle in the MBA program. He had grown up in Cincinnati with 2 parents who were present in a house that was not wealthy but was stable, and this stability read to Noelle as something she recognized intellectually, but had not experienced in her own body, the way you can understand a language you have never spoken. The rehearsal dinner was at the Whitmore house. Joanna had offered, and Noelle had accepted, and Della had not been invited because Noelle did not know how to explain to the Whitmores that their housekeeper was her mother without the explanation becoming the event. So she did not explain. She told Joanna the dinner was for close family only, which was true in a specific sense, and she told Della the dinner was a small thing at a restaurant, which was not true in any sense. And she moved through the week before her wedding in the specific exhaustion of a woman maintaining 2 versions of her life simultaneously and hoping the distance between them held. Della pressed Noelle's rehearsal dinner dress. She did it on a Sunday evening in the apartment on Clover Street with the iron she had owned for 15 years, and she moved it carefully around the beading at the neckline because the dress was delicate and the beading was small and the iron needed to be held at exactly the right angle. She hummed while she pressed. She did not know she was doing it. It was the sound she made when she was concentrating on something she cared about. A low, barely audible steadiness. She hung the dress on the hook behind Noelle's bedroom door. She stepped back and looked at it. She thought about a Tuesday in March 19 years ago when Noelle was 4 and had fallen asleep in the back seat of the car between the second and third house, and Della had sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes and watched her daughter sleep because waking her felt wrong, and because 20 minutes of watching Noelle sleep was the closest thing to rest that the day was going to offer. She had watched the small chest rise and fall. She had thought, I will do whatever this requires. Whatever this requires, I will do. She had done it. The dress was the receipt. The ceremony was at a church in Decatur, 300 seats, ivory flowers on every pew, the kind of wedding that costs what it costs. And Della had contributed what she could, which was the dress and the flowers for the bridal party and the rehearsal dinner she did not attend. The Whitmores were in the 3rd row. Della was in the 8th, between Curtis's aunt from Cincinnati and a college friend of Noelle's she had met once at graduation. She watched her daughter walk down the aisle. Noelle in the dress, the ivory against her skin, the way she held the bouquet slightly too tight because she was nervous, a thing only Della would notice because only Della had spent 25 years watching those hands. She looked beautiful. She looked like a woman who had arrived somewhere. She looked like the answer to a question Della had been asking for 19 years with her body instead of her mouth. The ceremony moved through its parts. The vows, which Curtis and Noelle had written themselves, and which were specific and unsentimental in a way that made 300 people cry anyway. The rings. The moment the pastor said, "You may," and Curtis smiled the way he smiled, privately, like the smile was for Noelle and the 300 people happened to be present. Then the pastor asked Noelle if she would like to say a few words before they were pronounced. Noelle turned to face the congregation. She held her bouquet in both hands. She was composed, the way she was always composed. The composure that had been trained on the floors of other people's houses, with a coloring book and an apple juice, and the understanding that her job was to be good, and to not make anything harder. She said, I would not be standing here today without the woman who believed in me before I had given her any reason to, who saw something in me when I was too young and too scared to see it in myself, who opened doors I didn't even know existed, who taught me what it looked like to show up with grace and intention and real, unconditional love. Della's hands tightened on the program. I need her to stand up right now so that everyone in this room can see her. Joanna, will you please stand? The third row moved. Joanna Whitmore rose from her seat. She had her hand on her chest. Her face arranged itself into the expression of a woman receiving something she had been expecting but was still moved to receive. Gracious, warm, composed in a different way than Noelle's composure, the composure of a woman who was accustomed to being acknowledged in rooms. 300 people applauded. Della was still looking at the third row. She was still holding the program. Her hands, the hands with the long fingers and the 19-year tremor and the heel that had not healed and the L4 pain that spread down the left leg like a tide. Those hands held the program without moving, and the paper did not make a sound because Della did not make sounds in rooms where she did not belong. She had been halfway to understanding what was happening when it finished happening. The applause was still going. Curtis was smiling at Joanna. The Whitmore family was luminous in the third row. Della was in the 8th. No one looked. She did not stand. She did not move. She sat in the 8th row of her daughter's wedding in the dress she had bought at a store she normally walked past, and she received the information quietly. The way you receive a diagnosis when you are a person who has been waiting for bad news long enough that your body is already prepared for it. She waited until the recessional. She stood. She walked to the aisle. She did not look toward the third row. She moved through the lobby the way she moved through the houses on Birchwood and Halcyon Drive, efficiently, without unnecessary motion, the body doing what it had been trained to do in spaces where it performed a function. She walked to the parking lot. She sat in her car. She turned on the engine for the air conditioning because it was June, and she did not want to arrive at the reception looking like a woman who had been sitting in a hot car feeling something. She was not going to the reception. She had decided this in the parking lot, simply and without drama, the way she made most decisions, by removing the options that required her to be something she was not, and choosing the one that the day actually permitted. She drove home. She changed out of the dress. She made herself a sandwich and ate it standing at the counter. She did not cry. She had spent 19 years learning not to cry at things she could not change, and the learning had been thorough. She turned on the television. She watched a program about a kitchen renovation. The cabinets were being replaced and the countertops were quartz, and the woman in the program kept saying the word intentional, and Della thought about intention and whether she had been intentional, and decided that she had been exactly as intentional as she knew how to be, and that intention was not the same as outcome, and that she had always known this even when it was easier to believe otherwise. She turned off the television. She read the card. It was not a card in a tin box. It was a piece of paper folded into quarters that Noelle had given her on the night before leaving for college 8 years ago. She had written on it in the handwriting of a 20-year-old who pressed too hard, the way left-handed people sometimes do. It said, "I know what this cost. I will not forget. I love you the most." Della kept it in the nightstand. She read it when she needed to. She read it that night after the television and the kitchen renovation and the standing and the sandwich, and she read it with the same attention she had read it 100 times before, looking for the thing underneath the words, the way you look for the stud behind the drywall. And she found what she always found, which was that the words were true when they were written. She put it back. She turned off the light. The person who called her the following morning was not Noelle. Her name was Faye Osei, 54. A caterer who had worked the Whitmore wedding reception. She had been with her catering company for 17 years, and she had worked events in this city long enough to know most of the families and most of the staff and some of the spaces between those two things. She was the kind of woman who noticed exits and entrances because that was her job, and her job had taught her that the most important things at any event happened in the periphery, not the center. She had noticed Della at the ceremony. She had not known who Della was, but she had seen her in row 8, and she had seen the moment the pastor asked Joanna to stand, and she had watched Della's hands on the program, and she had understood something that she could not have articulated precisely, but that she recognized the way you recognize the shape of a thing you have seen before in a different place. After the reception, she had asked the venue coordinator if she knew anything about the woman in the 8th row who had left before the cocktail hour. The coordinator said, "I don't know her." But I think she might be the mother. The bride's mother. I saw them together at the venue walkthrough last month. Faye went home. She thought about it. She was not a woman who involved herself in other people's business without reason. But she had a reason, which was that she had a daughter of her own, 28, living in Seattle, and she had been to enough weddings and enough funerals to understand the difference between what people say and what they mean and what they will regret. She got Della's number from the coordinator, who had it from the vendor contact sheet. She called the next morning. Della answered on the third ring. Her voice was even and practical in the way of women who have answered phones their entire lives expecting logistics. Faye said, "My name is Faye Osei. I catered your daughter's wedding yesterday. I'm calling because I think someone should, and because I watched what happened in that church, and I don't think you should be alone with it." The line was quiet. Faye said, "I've worked a lot of weddings. I know the difference between the people who are present and the people who made it possible. Yesterday, those were two different groups." Della said, "She's happy." Faye said, "That's not what I asked." The silence lasted longer than it should have. Through the phone, Faye could hear the ambient sounds of the apartment, a refrigerator hum, a ceiling fan, the ordinary acoustics of a place where a person lives alone. Della said, "She doesn't know I was there, at the ceremony. I didn't tell her I was coming." A pause. "I didn't want her to have to manage it." Faye held the phone. She understood something in that sentence that she did not say out loud. She said, "Can I bring you something? I always have food left over." Della said, "You don't have to do that." Faye said, "I know I don't." She brought jerk chicken and rice and peas in a container still warm from the transport bags. She left it on Della's doorstep with a piece of paper tucked under the lid. The paper said, "For the woman who pressed the dress. You did good work. All of it." Della found it when she opened the door to check the mail. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. She picked up the container. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and ate with the paper beside the plate. And she did not put the paper down while she ate. Faye came back. Not just that once. The following Tuesday she brought something else, rice and stewed chicken this time, and she sat at Della's kitchen table and they talked about practical things, because Faye understood that some women come to the harder things sideways, through the practical, through food and logistics and the ordinary architecture of a day. She asked about the heel. She asked about the hand that shook. She did not ask about Noel directly. She asked small questions, and she listened to the small answers, and she understood that the shapes inside the small answers were large. 3 weeks after the wedding, Noel called. The call was brief, the way calls had been brief for a while. The calls of a daughter who was busy, and whose busyness was real, and whose distance from her mother was not cruelty, but was the specific form of distance that forms when two people have spent a long time in different rooms of the same house and have forgotten that the house is the same. She said she and Curtis were settling in. She said the apartment was good. She said she had been meaning to call sooner. Della said, "I know you have a lot going on." She did not say, "I was at your wedding. I sat in row 8. I heard what you said from the 8th row, and I drove home, and I changed my clothes, and I made a sandwich, and I read your note, and I turned off the light." She did not say any of it. She had been not saying things her entire life. The habit was structural. It held her together in the way that habits hold things together when there is not enough of anything else. She said, "I love you." Noel said, "I love you too, Mom." She hung up. Della put the phone down on the counter. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she put on her shoes. She picked up her bag. She drove to the first house on Birchwood. She clocked in the way she always clocked in. She started with the kitchen. Faye was the one who called Noel. She did this without telling Della and without asking permission, because the asking would have produced a no, and the no would have been wrong, and Faye had lived long enough to know the difference between the no, that means stop, and the no, that means I don't know how to let someone do this for me. She called Noel on a Wednesday afternoon. She introduced herself. She said she had catered the wedding and that she had been spending time with Della and that she was calling because she thought Noel should know some things. She said Della had been cleaning houses for 19 years. She said the heel had not healed and the hand shook, and Della had not seen a doctor in more than 2 years because the copay was one more thing to subtract from the envelope. She said she believed Della had been at the ceremony and had sat in row 8 and had left before the cocktail hour without saying a word to anyone. She said one more thing. She said, "Your mother pressed your wedding dress on a Sunday night and hung it on your bedroom door. And I think she hummed while she did it. I don't know that for certain, but I think so, because that's the kind of woman she is, the kind that hums while she does the things no one will remember her for." The line was quiet for a long time. Noel said, "I didn't know she came." Faye said, "I know." Noel said, "I didn't know about the heel, or the hand." Faye said, "I know that too." Another silence, the kind that is not empty, the kind that is full of a woman beginning to understand the geometry of something she had been looking at from the wrong angle for a long time. Noel said, "Is she okay?" Faye said, "She's the same as she has always been, which means she is managing it, which means it's getting harder and she won't say so." Noel did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Can I call you back?" She did not call Faye back. She called Della. She did not announce that she knew. She did not begin with the ceremony or the 8th row or Faye's phone call. She said, "Mom, I'm coming this weekend. I want to take you to the doctor." Della said, "You don't have to do that." Noel said, "I'm not asking." There was a silence on the line that Della had not heard in a long time. Not the silence of two people who have nothing to say, the silence of two people who have too much and are deciding where to start. Della said, "Okay." Curtis drove. He had insisted, the way he insisted on things when he understood that insisting was the correct thing, quietly and without making it larger than it needed to be. He picked Della up at the apartment on Clover Street on a Saturday morning, and she came out wearing her good blue cardigan and her black flats, and she held her purse on her lap with both hands the whole drive. The doctor found what Faye's attention and Della's body had already found, that the tendon in the left heel had been stressed beyond what the compression wraps could address and needed real intervention, that the hand tremor was consistent with exhaustion and mild anemia and was treatable, that the L4 pain was structural and manageable with the right care. The doctor said she needed to reduce her workload. She said, "I'll see what I can do." The doctor looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has heard that sentence from a body that cannot afford to mean it, and who understands that pushing further in this room will only push the problem out into the parking lot. They drove home. Curtis stopped for food. He brought it into the apartment and set it on the kitchen table the way you set things down when you understand that the gesture is not about the food. Noel sat at the table across from her mother. She had been holding something since Faye's call, and she was still holding it. And she was not sure if now was when she put it down, or if that was a decision she needed to make with more preparation. She put it down. She said, "I know you were at the ceremony." Della looked at her. Noel said, "I know you were in row 8. And I know what you heard me say. And I know you drove home and didn't tell me." The kitchen was very quiet. Della said, "You were happy." Noel said, "You were in row 8. They looked at each other across the table. Outside a car passed. Somewhere in the building, music from another apartment. The city in its ordinary Saturday afternoon configuration, indifferent to the specific private thing happening in this kitchen on this floor. Noel said, "What I said about Joanna, those things were true. She did do those things." Della said, "I know." Noel said, "But I said them the way I said them, and you were in the 8th row, and I am not going to pretend that wasn't what it was." A silence. "I didn't know how to have both of you in the same room without explaining something I had never explained, so I kept you separate, and then the wedding came and I kept you separate there too, and you came anyway and you sat in row 8 and I said what I said." She stopped. "I don't know how to." She stopped again. Della said, "You don't have to." Noel said, "I think I do." She reached into her purse. She took out a piece of paper. It was the note she had written to Della 8 years ago, folded into quarters, the handwriting pressed too hard in the way of left-handed people who grip. She looked at it. She said, "I wrote this because I knew what it cost. I still know. I think I forgot to act like I knew." She put it on the table between them. Della looked at the paper. She did not pick it up. She had read it enough times that she did not need to read it again. She knew exactly where the words were, and what they said, and what they had cost Noel to write, and what they had cost her to keep believing. She said, "What Joanna did for you, I couldn't have done. That's true. That's just true. She gave you things I did not have to give, and I am not angry at her for giving them." Noel said, "I know." Della said, "But I was in row 8. It was not an accusation. It was a fact, stated the way Della stated all facts, plainly, without inflection, the way a woman states things when she has spent a long time in rooms where her presence was functional and her feelings were not the point. Noel said, "You were in row 8, and I should have known you'd come. I should have put you in row 1. The silence this time was different, not the silence before something. The silence after. Della reached across the table. She put her hand over Noel's. Her hand with the long fingers. The hand that shook when it was tired. The hand that had ironed the wedding dress and turned patience and mocked floors and pressed pencils into homework papers and rubbed circles on small shoulder blades at 2 in the morning. She put that hand over her daughter's hand, and she left it there. She said, "You're here now." Noel turned her hand over and held her mother's hand, the way you hold something you understand you have been holding wrong and are now trying to learn the correct grip. She called Joanna that evening. She did not rehearse it. She said, "I need to tell you something about the woman who has been cleaning your house. Her name is Della Reyes. She's my mother. I should have told you years ago. I don't know exactly why I didn't, except that I didn't know how to explain it without it becoming the explanation. But you should know. And she should know that you know." Joanna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long?" Noel said, "Since I was 4. Another silence, the kind that contains a woman recalibrating. Joanna said, "I've been in that house on Thursdays for 6 years. She's been there every single time. And I've never." She stopped. "I offered her a glass of water once. She said no thank you." Noel said, "That sounds right." Joanna said, "I want to call her." Noel said, "She'll say she's fine." Joanna said, "I know, I'll call her anyway." Fayose never asked to be thanked. She went back to work the Monday after the wedding the way she always went back to work. She had events through the summer and a daughter in Seattle who called on Sundays and a kitchen that needed new tile and the ordinary accumulation of a life that did not require a ceremony to be significant. She brought food to Della on Tuesdays, not every Tuesday, but often enough that Della stopped being surprised by it and started leaving the door unlocked, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. She asked, one Tuesday in August, how the heel was. Della said the physical therapist thought 6 weeks. Faye said, "Good." She said it the way people say things when good is enough, when they do not need more from the word than what it already is. What happened after that happened slowly, the way things happen when they are done correctly. Noel started calling more. Not longer calls, not dramatic calls, but more frequent. The texture of contact restored to something that felt like regularity. She came on weekends sometimes. She and Curtis both, and Curtis had a quality that Della recognized over time as the quality of a man who understood that showing up for his wife sometimes meant showing up for her mother, and who did this without commentary, which was its own form of grace. Joanna Whitmore learned the name of the woman who had cleaned her house for 6 years. She said the name the way you say a name when you are saying it for the first time and you are aware of how long you should have said it already. She wrote Della a letter. A real letter on paper, not an email, because she was old enough to understand when a thing required paper. She said she was sorry for the specific kind of noticing that is not malice but is its own kind of failure. She said she had been the beneficiary of Della's work for 6 years without understanding what that work was part of. She said she hoped that was not too late to name. Della read the letter at the kitchen counter. She read it twice. She folded it and put it in the nightstand drawer next to the note from Noel. 2 pieces of paper, both of them true, both of them late, both of them enough. The world does not give you back what it takes. It takes years and heels and the use of your dominant hand on a good day. It takes the front row and the first word and the version of the moment you spent 19 years working toward. It takes those things and it does not explain itself. But sometimes someone notices. Not the right person, not the first time, not in the way you imagined on the bus ride home from the third house with your daughter asleep in the back seat. Someone different. Someone who is simply paying attention because attention is what they have to offer, and they have decided you are worth the offering. And sometimes that is how the distance closes, not all the way. Not at once, but enough. Enough to sit at a kitchen table on a Saturday with your daughter's hand in your hand, and the city going about its ordinary business outside, and the food on the table going cold because neither of you is eating yet, and both of you know that this is what it looks like when something comes back to you. That looks like this. It looks like not much. It looks like everything. Before you go, tell us. Who saw you when no one else was looking? Who showed up when it would have been easier not to? Leave their name in the comments. We'll see you in the next one. There's a moment in this story that I can't stop thinking about. Della pressing that wedding dress on a Sunday night, moving the iron carefully around the beading, humming without knowing she was humming. Nobody asked her to do it. Nobody was watching. She did it because that's who she was, not who she was performing, just who she was when no one was looking. I think about how long she had been doing things like that. 19 years of Tuesday mornings and worn left heels and ibuprofen she stopped counting. 19 years of building something with her hands and her body, and never once asking to be the one standing at the front of the room for it. And when the front of the room finally came, she sat in row 8 and drove herself home and made a sandwich and didn't say a word. What strikes me about Della isn't the sacrifice. Plenty of people sacrifice. What strikes me is the discipline of it. The way she kept showing up with the same quality of care on the worst days as on the best ones. The way she turned patients gently and mopped floors precisely and pressed beading carefully, even when everything underneath her was breaking down. That's not just endurance. That's a kind of integrity that most people never develop, because most people never get pushed far enough to find out if it's in them. And Noelle. I don't think Noelle was a bad person. I think she was a person who had learned to move between two worlds and had gotten so skilled at the moving that she forgot the cost of the distance. That happens. It happens to people who are smart and driven and who have worked hard and who have also been given things by people who weren't their mothers. The receiving doesn't cancel the owing. But it can blur it if you let it. Noelle let it for a while. What changed her wasn't guilt. It was information. Faye called her and told her the truth about her mother's heel, and her mother's hand, and her mother in row 8. And Noelle had enough honesty in her to hear it, and enough courage to call back and say, "I'm coming this weekend." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "Let me explain." Just, "I'm coming." That's the difference between understanding something and actually doing something about what you understand. Faye is the one I think about the most, though. She didn't have to call. She wasn't family. She wasn't owed anything. She called because she noticed, and because she decided that noticing without acting was its own kind of failure, and because she had lived long enough to know that the people who hum while they do the work no one remembers them for are the ones who most need someone to remember them. The cause and the effect in this story are so clear once you see them. Della gave everything she had with consistency and without condition, and that built something real in her daughter. Real enough that when Noelle finally understood what she'd done, she didn't fall apart. She showed up. She sat at the table. She turned her hand over and held her mother's correctly. That's what all of it was for. Not the dress, not the front row, not the acknowledgement in a church full of people. Just the hand, held correctly, finally at a kitchen table in an apartment on Clover Street on a Saturday afternoon. That was the receipt. That was always going to be the receipt.